everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of ForbesWomen. Election cakes date back to the 1700s. Even though tomorrow, everyday bakers will be baking as they cope with election anxiety, including this reporter. Joining us now to talk about the cultural history here and the culinary history is KC Hysmith. She's a food scholar and American studies expert who's done a lot of writing on the subject of election cakes. KC, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So every year around election time, people talk about stress eating, stress baking, but there is a history here, a tradition, if you will, that really goes back. Where did election cakes get their start?
So they date back to the earliest elections of the colonial days. They were something that were actually brought over, with our colonial forefathers and foremothers, I guess. And so they have their roots in early English cakes as well. And they were simply a cake that was baked to feed a lot of people. Elections were a little different back in that time, and everybody would travel from their property, which everyone was a little more spread out. Travel took more time. And so it was a bigger adventure to go places. And our elections were, polling places were an exciting place to be. And so women would bake these cakes to feed all the men who came to vote, and sometimes their families that they brought along with them. And sometimes people would extend their stays because travel took longer. And so you'd need cake for longer as well. So the cake fed a lot of people. They were giant cakes. And then they had a pretty decent shelf life based on their ingredients.
I want to talk about those ingredients because when I first read about election cakes, I'm an amateur baker, not even good enough to get on Great British Baking or British enough. But I was like, let me give this a try. And then I saw one recipe. There were like 9 pounds of butter, 14 pounds of flour. There were fruits that needed to be soaked and possibly yeast. It looked far too complicated. But what was the traditional election cake as it was originally conceived?
Yeah, so election cake, again, was based off of these original recipes that were brought over from largely England. And they're a type of cake called a plum cake, Plumb. And plum was kind of a catch-all term for dried fruits or fruit-studded cakes. And so they were just kind of a fruit cake, just extra large, extra big, or multiple cakes, multiple loaves of the same kind of thing. And they were yeasted. They used yeast to rise. So they kind of seem on compared to the way we eat cakes today, they would seem more like bread, more like a dense bread or something like you'd get a slice of in a coffee shop nowadays. They were enriched dough, which meant that they had a lot of eggs. So they were very dense and very rich, and then a lot of sugar. And they were usually fortified, and the shelf stability came in with the dried fruits, which again were soaked. And they were usually soaked in some kind of alcohol or spirits, like a brandy or a sweet wine. And again, that helps them stay shelf stable and make it extra sweet as well. And then some of them were frosted with an icing that's kind of similar to royal icing on fancy cookies. When you get fancy cookies today, that kind of hardens. Some of them were iced with that as well. So everyone had a different kind of approach to it, but largely it was all kind of the same thing, the same ingredients. And then if you were baking for election day, or any other big gathering like a wedding or a funeral even, you would just increase the ratio of the ingredients. So, 30 quarts of flour is the first recipe ever published for election cake, calls for 30 quarts of flour, which is a lot.
That is a large gathering. Now, you wrote a really interesting piece that published this morning about how sometimes election cakes are misattributed to the feminist movement, or the way people talk about election cakes and women is often incorrect. So what do we as a society get wrong about how women were involved in the baking of election cakes?
So every year, every election, we talk about election cakes. If you look at historical newspapers dating back even to, the late 1800s when, regular newspapers were happening, which again, election cakes weren't called election cakes until after the American Revolution. So the cake itself and the way we know it and the way we talk about it is already a look back in a nostalgic, patriotic way. So every year, there has been an election cake coverage of some sort. And every year it typically tends to focus on the women, the sweet women, sweet little women. They couldn't do anything, so they baked cakes instead. And it always comes off as very patronizing and condescending, instead of really focusing in on this really radical act of doing something when you can do very little else. inserting yourself into situations, which is what they've done. They've made themselves necessary for hospitality, for conversations. They can now hear conversations as they're serving cake. They can't vote necessarily, but they might be able to bend the ear of people that they're serving cake to. So they are giving themselves an avenue into these political spaces that they would otherwise not have access to. And I just don't think that that's covered enough every time we talk about it year after year.
That's so interesting. And as a journalist who first read about this in a competing publication, I admit that my instinct was like, oh, how nice. It's a thing for women to do when they couldn't vote. But the point about it putting them in the rooms where conversations were happening, I think is such an important one as we talk about inclusivity and hearing all voices and having all voices engaged in the political process, right? Your vote, it's your voice. This is almost the colonial version of that.
Yeah, and I do think, I have a colleague who's a baker and studies bread, and I mentioned her in my Substack too in this post, how one thing that's overlooked a lot too is the labor that's involved in any colonial cooking, just because that's open hearth cooking and people were foraging for things and milling their own flour. There's a whole level there. But to cook, to bake something this size, to prep for something this size, whether that's milling the flour, drying the fruits to then soak them, saving the spirits, rationing the sugar. There's a lot of labor going into these cakes that isn't really acknowledged at any point, really, along the way as we move forward in time. So I think that's another really important aspect that gets overlooked, that cakes take time and effort, and we bake them for other people, and hopefully they allow you a place at the table.
Hopefully they allow you a place at the table. I want to emphasize that. Now, have you ever tried to make a traditional, what we now call election cake, with that yeasted dough and with those rum-soaked fruits?
Yes, I, like many other people during the pandemic, tried my hand at sourdough. I am a sweets baker, a cake baker. I'm not a bread baker at all. But I did try during the pandemic, like most other folks. And that is when we saw another little revival in actually making the cakes, not just talking about them, was during the sourdough pandemic timeframe. And so I did try one in November 2020. And I really like using my cakes to have messages on top. And I work a lot with icing and frosting. So it really bummed me out to not have that for this cake. So I used some of those fruits to spell out the word vote on top. I couldn't step away and leave it as is. But it's an interesting bake. It's very different than the kinds of cakes that we would eat nowadays, at least here in America.
Now, your piece today says something that I find super interesting and that I had been struggling to find an answer to on the internet. Can any cake be an election cake, or does it have to be a yeasted, bread-like pastry with dried fruit inside?
So personally, I think, based off of what we know about election cakes in the past, and again, knowing that they weren't called election cakes in the earliest colonial elections, they were just cake, maybe a rich cake, maybe plum cake. Based off of other recipes we know they were similar, just larger versions of from early colonial cookbooks. They weren't called election cake then. They were only called that in a nostalgic looking back way, like I said. So I think we can really stretch the boundaries of what we call an election cake. And we've definitely seen examples of this, through different election cycles in the past, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. We saw people really stretching what they were calling election cakes, especially in the women's pages and newspapers. Sometimes they were just cakes frosted on top with political messages like "go vote," or a longer, more poetic phrase related to maybe a past president. You also saw the heavy use of the Democratic and Republican Party imagery, the little donkey and the little elephant. They were real cute, like surrounding a cake, iced on the sides. And that cake was called an election cake in that newspaper. So I think we've already had people pushing the boundaries of what counts as an election cake. We also have, other election cakes. There's the Hartford election cake, which is connected to Connecticut back in the 1800s. And that one is very similar to the original election cake. And, that one has a name. It's the Hartford election cake. And these others are just more generally election cakes. So I personally believe that we can really stretch the boundaries of what we consider an election cake and include all the different varieties of cakes people are making today to exercise their right to vote, to talk about various issues that they find really important, to support one candidate or the other, just really anything that they want to talk about in relation to the election.
Now, I know you mentioned that during the pandemic, and we all experienced this, those of us who started baking, there was a surge in home bakers and an interest in baking. But what do you make of the increased interest in election cakes year after year? Does it indicate greater political participation, greater political interest, or is it just, to reference my very clearly favorite show, Great British Baking, we're all just watching Food Network and Great British Baking?
I think there's a little bit of that. Like, I don't think it's right to dismiss the power of the Great British Baking Show or any of the other, baking enthusiast things that have gotten us as a society and a larger global society really into baking and cooking in general. We're definitely in a very particular era of everyone is very excited to know more about food, whatever version of that is. But I think we also can't dismiss the work that folks have done to really get out the vote, get younger people voting, and using social media to really push that agenda. And, when those two collide, social media and voting and baking, when all of that collides, you have folks wanting to share these things that they're making. And like I said, for me, I see it as a blank canvas. So why wouldn't you write a political message or whatever message you wanted, unless it's someone's birthday, that's empty space that you could use. So I think there's this perfect storm of things happening in our society that's really pushing these election cakes forward. And I think it would also be, we'd be remiss to kind of overlook too the fact that a lot of women's rights have kind of been in question in the past decade, and more recently in the past the past two administration cycles. And when you see more women talking about that on top of cakes, you do wonder, are they harkening back to the earlier election cakes when they didn't have voices and are starting to lose their voices now? So, it's really easy to see those through lines, I think.
It's been interesting as a layperson for me to watch political messaging cakes, at least in my part of the internet and what I follow on Instagram, kind of explode. I've seen what you're referencing. Some are just go vote. Some are very pro one message or another. And it does feel like there are a lot of women who are putting these forward, even though we know that men can make great cakes. Men can be great cooks. All genders can bake. And I almost hesitate to ask this question, but we have in this political cycle one candidate who has shown an interest in baking or in cooking, and it happens to be the female candidate in the presidential election. And I've hesitated to talk about that because I feel like when women talk about food too much, it then further genders the entire notion of cooking. But what do you make of the significance of having a presidential candidate who is so clearly interested in food, to the point that their campaign put out a video where that candidate received a cookbook from her supporters?
Yeah, I think it always brings to mind, and I was a little kid when this happened, so I don't remember it except in newspapers, but the Hillary Clinton issue with the First Lady cookies, where she said a comment about, I could have stayed home and baked cookies, and that received giant backlash, and that actually started the First Lady cookie bake-off in the Family Circle magazine. They took that and ran with it, which I found really interesting. And ever since then, before the magazine folded a few years ago, that's been something that they've done. And that's because cooking and baking was not inherently part of Hillary Clinton's life. That's not something she really went to find joy, at least not that she shared with all of us strangers and of the world. But Vice President Harris, that does seem to be something that she truly, genuinely finds joy in, as an individual and as a family. And then, of course, culturally, she comes from very food-rich traditions and cultural backgrounds where food is such an important part of sharing those traditions. And, for her to deny that part of herself and to hide that away would just not be authentic. And that seems to be a really big driver of her campaign. And it also seems to come through with Governor Tim Walz and his love of cooking. He's won cooking competitions. And then I think what is really telling too is all the recipes that they've been sharing through their political campaign. Donate today. I'll give you my mom's cornbread dressing recipe in time for Thanksgiving from Harris. And then what I think is really cool is Walz's team is sharing his wife's grandmother's cookie recipe, but they don't center it on him. They center it on his wife and her grandmother. So whoever's writing the copy is doing a great job of really making it clear this is someone else's intellectual property, and we are participating in this great American tradition of recipe sharing, and in doing so, creating a community. And of course, that's also part of the language of giving to a campaign. But I think that what they're trying to do is really engage with voters in this way that still feels authentic to the candidates. And I think that's how Kamala, or I feel weird saying her first name. I think that's how Vice President Harris is, for lack of a better way of saying it, getting away with talking about food as a woman, because she genuinely does enjoy it, and it does not seem to hinder her work, her work that we as the American people need her to do in whatever, position she's in now as vice president.
I like that point. If you focus on the joy, it comes from an authentic place. And I have a lot of male family members and friends who are genuinely excited to, well, maybe not excited, but they will be stress baking and stress cooking this election cycle. So as I said before, it's all genders. But KC, as we wrap up this conversation, is there anything else you want the Forbes audience to know about the cultural history around election baking and the so-called election cakes?
I would just encourage you to ask folks in your community, especially older folks, to see if they've ever made election cakes, what they might have done, differently than the recipes that are colonial inspired that we're talking about, a lot right now. I'd really urge you to look in any old cookbooks that you might have on your family shelves, or maybe your parents' or grandparents' shelves, because they might have an election cake recipe, which I think is a really fun thing to talk about together and talk about how it's changed. And then barring that, go, if you're going to doom scroll the #election cake hashtag, and, look at other people's cakes, because there's everybody from all sides, including folks from other places of the world, that are using the tag to share cakes about whatever political messages, they're beholden to.
Well, and 49% of the world's population voted or will vote by the end of 2024. So it stands to reason that there is quite a diversity of recipes to be found under that hashtag.
Exactly.
KC Hysmith, thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate your time and your insight on election cakes.
Thank you. It was fun to talk.